Hello, all you good investors. Welcome to today's show. I have an amazing guest with me. Julia Grady is Executive Director of 10C Shared Space. Julia, welcome to the show.
Hey, Tim. It's awesome to be here today.
Yeah, I've been a huge fan of your work. We've been following it along for quite a while. 10C is a shared space, so it's a co working space in Guelph, Ontario, but it's so much more than that. I know there's a lot of community, there's a lot of really cool things happening there, that it is sort of a physical building, but it's a lot more than that. So really excited to have you here because you've been on quite a journey. When I started, the address was 10C, and now you used a community bond to be able to actually purchase a building a little further down the street. But can you sort of tell us that story? Was sort of the origin of 10C, and then how did that community bond really help you level up?
Yeah, so Tensi we started in 2007, 2008, looking at how we could create a local hub for community members to come together to talk about issues that were important to them. And we very quickly realized that access to space was one of our core challenges. So we ended up renting a small little space at 10 Carden Street for the first long time, and then expanded that with a vision to purchase and own real estate as a way to build some permanency, not just for 10C as an organization, but for the social and community sector in Guelph to use that space. And a lot of 10C's work, I'm going to say, Tim, is like framed around this notion of community wealth building. So for our individuals and organizations to really like look at local economies, how we can both strengthen our financial capital as well as our social and cultural and political capital. So it made sense for us to look at how can we kind of collectively move from like a small little rented space as an organization into like a larger owned space. We needed to grow both the model as well as the long-term financing. And our former space was maybe like 700 square feet when we started, and we ended up taking on the next 2 floors of the building. And that was still only like 2,800 square feet. So it really is still too small to have like the longevity and durability that we wanted. And then it wasn't physically accessible. So for us, we wanted a big mandate. Our mandate was like around like connection and inclusion. So to do that, you need to be in a physically accessible space. It seemed like very common sense. And in old downtowns, there's not a lot of physically accessible spaces. So we started looking for physically accessible space, and there were not many on the market. And the time to go into like an existing space, like just held by like a traditional landlord, really didn't make any sense to us. It needed a longer lead time as well as the longevity of knowing we could enter into like a 20 or 30-year agreement. So we saw that purchasing space as being like the main way we would do that. And at the time, we were an organization that had like $100,000 budget and was really like small. So we basically like built the model at the same time as growing the scale of our operations. And right about now, we're about just between 1.6 and $2 million a year is like the scale of 10C. And what we've been able to do with that is purchase and renovate an old building that is now this like landmark, beautiful facility in downtown, and gives us a pathway to building community equity. And then when I say community equity, it's like for the nonprofit, but it's also in the next generation when there's no debt held against the building. This will be an asset for any of the change makers that are needed here. And I really see community bonds as the thing that lets nonprofits and charities like have that longer term vision. So we're not just thinking in like short, like 3 to 5 year cycles. We are thinking like generationally. And then, Tim, a bunch about community bonds, but for people who don't, it's essentially a vehicle that lets nonprofits and charities raise capital from local community members, as well as other organizations, institutions who want to directly invest in organizations. And in the case of real estate backed community bonds, they're backed by the value of a real estate property, whether it's like housing or commercial real estate. So our
Amazing.
goal at the beginning was to renovate a property that had not very much value at that point, but grow the value so that it could compare head to head with a typical commercial property. And I'd say that we've gotten to that point, and now we're working on just building our own equity within that. And 150 community investors helped us get there.
That's so cool. I love it. I mean, I really want to unpack a little bit the difference between sort of community wealth versus a community bond, because I think it's such a cool concept, this idea of community wealth. It sounds to me as more like a philosophy,
Yeah.
or sort of a guiding principle, that community wealth is really about so much more than just money. It is
Yes.
about community. It is about sort of the energy. It's about the entrepreneurial spirit. It's about these notions of belonging,
Yeah.
right, within the community. And I think that there are all of these amazing spin-offs, from what you've done. In my world as a sort of sustainable economist, I talk a lot about externalities, and I find myself unfortunately focused on a lot of negative externalities,
Yeah.
like the CO2 emissions and pollution and, exploitation of people or the planet, sort of the bad stuff. But with community wealth, I mean, there's all of these positive externalities
Hmm.
where, tell us a little bit about, just like almost like the vibe on the street, on Carden Street now, that, and how sort of you're building by now having that in community hands, has just sort of created those positive spin-offs, is building community wealth.
Yeah, for sure. So a few things there. So community wealth, I really think it's a way, all of our money has an impact, whether it's positive or negative, right? And I think fundamentally as citizens, we need to like think about like our power in that, whether it's
Mm.
investing or if it's like our daily purchases. So as a starting point, like as a nonprofit landlord, we're a way that other organizations can make sure that their funds are going into and staying within the sector. We house and have about a membership of about 320 different individuals, organizations, and many of those are like what I'd call community entrepreneurs. So they're working on something that still has a purpose, community purpose, whether they're from in a co-op, a nonprofit, charity, or a for-profit organization. And our job is to create like the spaces and call it like the facilities that they can do that work in. And on our fourth floor here, we have a commercial kitchen, and it supports the livelihoods of about 20 different food creators. So
Wow.
they use that kitchen to like run and grow their community business. And that is like local independent entrepreneurship. So Tensi has that as a really strong focus, in addition to all of the like community, like nonprofit and charitable organizations support. And I think that collectively, what I'd like Guelph to move forward to is more organizations advocating for things like social procurement, because that's also one of the main tenets of a community wealth building strategy in a place-based economy. Like, let's think about where money is going and what it's used for. So long term, I think that's work that we'll be diving into as well. And community bonds actually showed me that individuals thought that was important. So people were looking for like local investment ways to participate. And this was one product that they could invest in.
Amazing. And yeah, I'm a huge proponent of community bonds. Really is a really cool way for people to be able to put sort of their money where their values are. And I love this story. Like for me, what you've done is such a perfect use case, because we need more social enterprises, nonprofits, organizations. It's really hard. Like as someone who started a social enterprise, like those
Yeah.
first years were just so challenging and so difficult and so demoralizing, and I felt so alone. And so to have a space where people can go both on a practical level, like where people
Yeah.
can meet clients and have meetings and, kind of get stuff done, but then also on an emotional level, like
Totally.
a community where people can, sort of, you can high five when you get a new client, someone
Yep.
that'll buy you a shot, when you lose a big client, or,
Yeah.
sort of need a little pick me up. I think that stuff is just so valuable. Really, this is the building you've got. It's up and running. That it's sort of a home that community bonds build, but but at the same time, there are still community bonds available now, right? Like,
Yeah.
I know I've talked to you that you often sort of have like a wait list going, and that at any given time there may or may not be bonds available, but I think you do have some available right now. Is that right?
Yeah, Tim, we do. So right now we have about 200,000 available, and bonds pay like their fixed rates. So it goes from 2.75% up to 4%.
Amazing.
Yeah.
Awesome. So, anyone who's listening who has a little room in their portfolio, has some cash they want to allocate to community bonds, happy to point you towards Julia. And that from there, this is really, I would imagine, kind of kick-started your interest in sustainable finance, impact investing. Like,
Yeah.
I can only sort of imagine the learning curve that you've been through, actually going through and issuing a bond. And then now, sort of what else do you have kind of cooking up in the social finance space?
Yeah, many things. And I think going back to the community bond, people ask, what do I do next? And at that
Mm,
time, like 10 years ago, there weren't many what's next, right? Like there were maybe like 6 or 7 different options. And now there's this there is a growing and maturing sector of individuals have like many options. One of the challenges there is you need to find the options, right? So
mm,
the SVX's Impact X platform is a good way to find what's happening. And it sparked us to build really social finance in as one of our call it activity pillars. Well, like we do placemaking, we do community learning and engagement, and social finance, and the new applications of social finance is really what's next. We are developing a program called Harvest Impact, which will be a community lending fund. And we also know that access to capital is not equal across populations and across like even business types. So there's lots of financing that entrepreneurs need, like the entrepreneurs in our kitchen to start out. They need a little small financing that can grow into like larger and then move into like sometimes more mainstream financing. And so we're building a fund basically that will support that in Guelph, Wellington, and Southern Ontario. And we're just finishing our first pilot phase, Tim, where we put out about 600, almost $600,000 of capital to a variety of entrepreneurs. Over 80% were women and equity deserving people, all working on food, farm, and environment. And now we're using that data to then design the fund, and then we'll have that as another vehicle that people locally can invest in, as well as like foundations and institutions. So building a fund amongst all of the other community lending funds that are emerging up across Canada, like we see, is really important because people need access to affordable debt to start, right? Like,
yeah.
so affordable debt that is fair, inclusive, as well as like the wraparound services that entrepreneur hubs can provide, whether it's peer relationships or like mentorship and other like deep content. We're here working here to provide that.
That's so cool. I mean, I love food as a sector. Like, I think it's such a great way, bringing people together. Again, all these benefits, and it's such a hard industry. I did a
Yeah,
little bit of work for a sort of food incubator here in Toronto doing it, and I got to meet all of these sort of food entrepreneurs, people making it. And oh my goodness, like
yeah,
it can be so challenging, and there's such sort of stiff competition, right? That when it comes to a lot of the big food manufacturers, it's so processed, but it's also so cheap that they have these massive economies of scale, and there are huge
yeah,
barriers getting into grocery stores. And really,
yeah,
it's such a challenging space. So, definitely, I think it's a critical industry for so many reasons, food security, sustainability, all of these awesome things. Guelph, I know, is like a great place for food,
yeah,
and lots of great inputs there, certainly. And then the financing piece is just so critical. Now, in terms of creating that fund, I think there's potentially an important distinction here, because when it comes to the building, right, and 10C is like, community bond investments, people loaning money to a building, that's going to be backed by the asset, right? So that's, if worst case scenario, right, if something happened and the nonprofit went under and we don't like thinking about that too much, but as
Yeah.
investors, we want to look at that worst case scenario. Then not a big deal. We now have this beautiful building in Guelph that, the nonprofit would sell that asset. Bondholders would get part, if not all of their money back, depending
Yeah.
on sort of the value of the building and how much was outstanding, things like that. But when it comes to loans to entrepreneurs, I have to imagine that's not the case.
Yeah, there's different funds. So let's call it the loss rate that funds are planning for is between really like 5 and say 20%. And the 20% comes from basically a commitment to put financing where it's needed most, and to because we know that there's like huge problems with equity, just not access to financing, right? And particularly with like women and call it multicultural entrepreneurs, especially when they don't have their own assets to back them. So the community financing projects that are really emerging across Canada, including Harvest, are really looking at how can we like deploy capital when people don't already have assets to back their own loss. And the loss rates that we experienced in just our pilot program, we're like under 5%. So we can, as funds, develop structures to back like between the 5 and 20%. What we're hoping to do long term with 10C is, as we have more equity, financial equity in the property, the value of that property can also back the fund. So we'll get there in a number of years, but that's the direction I want to chart with, like how the building and the impact fund are linked. And then in the meantime, we know that across the federal government released the social finance fund a couple of years ago. There's like $755 million that's basically growing this whole new sector. And one of the pieces that a number of us believe is missing infrastructure is something called a loan guarantee pool. So we have formed with and there's lots of loan guarantee programs that the different governments and institutions have. You could start let's go back to a simpler example. If at the beginning, when 10C was running doing our building and this ambitious project to renovate an old property, if the municipal government or another like large entity had come in with a loan guarantee, that would have made everything much easier. We didn't have that. It wasn't commonplace for organizations to then have external backers. So a 1-to-1 loan guarantee, just like your parents might do if you're getting a first mortgage, if you're in your 30s now, would guarantee that if you can't make your payments, your parents will make your payments. And essentially a guarantee pool acts in the same way, except that instead of having just one actor backing and another single actor, it's like a many to many. So we have a pool of backers essentially who will back the debt issuing social finance intermediaries across Canada.
Amazing. So this is really cool. So let's unpack this, because this was really, for me, the impetus for us to chat, because I've been, interviewing people throughout sort of the last several months since Mark Carney became prime minister.
Yeah.
And I was always been asking people, okay, so if you could tell Mark Carney to do one thing, be a little angel on his shoulder saying, hey, could you do, what do we need to build a better sustainable finance ecosystem in Canada? And this idea kept coming up of an impact loan guarantee. And so let's unpack it a little bit, because this is just to make it clear. I love your analogy of almost like having parents sort of like co-signing a mortgage.
Yeah.
Right. Such that when parents do that, it doesn't cost them a penny. They don't have to, set aside money from their own budget or from their own investment accounts to do this. It really is just about using their credit rating, which they've had more time to be able to establish, to be able to do that, to then be able to lower the risk of that loan, so that then the bank can, essentially give you a better rate and feel more comfortable doing that. Which, there's certainly some privilege involved in that situation, and parents that are able to do that. But my goodness, that's a huge way for people to be able to help out. And so in the same way, we've got these sort of scrappy nonprofits, right? Which might, of a certain size, some are bigger than others. And then at the same time, I know as treasurer of a couple nonprofits, getting access to debt, if you haven't been around for very long, the banks really
Yeah.
don't like doing that. And so now all of a sudden, we would essentially have the federal government, the idea that you're putting forward here is that the government would offer a guarantee saying that we will essentially co-sign on that debt, and that we can use our sort of, better credit rating, right? And that strength to then be able to offer a lower risk, and then such that nonprofits can then borrow at a lower interest rate. Do I have that right?
You have a chunk of that, but let's walk through it because I
Perfect.
definitely agree
Yeah.
on the unpacking. So impact guarantee, we've been working on, as I call it, as a sector. So myself and Christy Fairholm Mader, as both individuals who are running impact funds that are just debt issuing across Canada, recognize that this is missing infrastructure.
Mm.
So we're working in a project, we'll call it a container called the Catalytic Capital Lab, which brings together foundations like Definity or West or Inspirit and McConnell, etc., to look at what is missing infrastructure right now that can really help the social finance field grow and expand. And I'm going to use the word durable a lot because, and be more durable. And we know that social finance intermediaries, so a social finance intermediary is basically a fund like Harvest Impact or Fair Finance or Thrive Impact, which is Christie's fund out west. They exist with not very much margin on what they can actually gain by having a fund, but know that the impacts will be deep in either their communities, whether they're physical communities or communities of interest. And the impact guarantee would basically back what we're building is basically a $50 to $300 million unfunded guarantee pool. So the money still sits with the other foundations or government or other large institutions, but they're just backing any of a percent of the losses. So we pull together not government first, but foundations and the private sector first, so that we can have this all of sector approach. So the goal is that this is a program that does not sit inside government, but sits outside in the sector that is actually growing the social finance movement across Canada. So we will have, I think at the end of the day, we'll probably have like 10 to 30 foundations participating, and that will support basically 20 to 30 social finance intermediaries to basically be backed by this thing called impact guarantee. And then I can walk through like some mechanics of how we imagine it will work and the level of risk that we think these organizations are helping absorb into the sector, for then the great social, environmental, and cultural impacts of making sure that more people who need capital to do their work have access to it.
Amazing. So if I have this right, where you were talking before that there is, that right now as a fund, you would have to sort of plan for a sort of failure rate of kind of 5% to 20%, that if you've
Yeah.
got 100, you've made 100 different loans to social enterprises, that, somewhere between 5 to 20 of those, would end up failing, which obviously the hope is that the rest of those are able to support it. And that's a beautiful use of diversification, and the beauty of
Yeah.
a fund there, that you can do that. But now you're kind of taking that diversification to another level, saying, well, wait a minute, if we can essentially almost like pool the risk of multiple different funds together, and then have an overarching, almost like umbrella of capital, that again is there to be able to provide that sort of loan loss guarantee, is what I'm hearing there. That what that'll do is really use, diversification at an even broader level to
Yeah.
then be able to create a healthier ecosystem for the entire country. Is that right?
Yeah, Tim, that's 100% it. It's that, and that's why this like many to many approach is so important to us. It needs multiple investors as well as multiple social finance intermediaries, because each of those intermediaries is working with like 30 to maybe 200 actual entrepreneurs, whether they're nonprofit, co-ops, charities, etc., or for profits, that are creating the change that we need.
That's so cool. I love this because, really it is about collaboration,
Yeah,
right? It's coming together, but it's also like through a risk lens. Like it's
yeah,
not just sort of kumbaya, let's sit in a circle and share our stories and our failures, but it's no like, let's pool our money together. Let's understand that when we do come together through a risk lens, we can use diversification to our advantage. And then, really there's still going to be that individual risk at the company level, right? Like for an
yeah,
entrepreneur, you're always taking that risk. There's
yes.
no way around that. But what it's going to allow us to do is, as an ecosystem, really spread that risk across many actors, knowing that as long as some of us that succeed, the ones that do succeed, right, are then, also supporting everyone else. And that I love this idea because to me, there's been, I think, a little bit of a lack of collaboration across the different levels. I've always felt this different power dynamic that for me as a social entrepreneur, who's trying to get money, when I was
Yeah,
trying to raise money for a microloan so that I could
yeah,
rebrand my company, you go to these asset owners and they sort of have all the power in the world. And there's a really funny dynamic there as well. And so, but for me, basically not only being able to join a circle of other social entrepreneurs and pool risk on that level, but then to then really be able to collaborate with the asset owners and the funders and being able to see a level of collaboration there. And then help me understand, like, do we need government involvement? Like,
yeah.
do we need Mark Carney for this? Like, it sounds to me like this could just be a by the ecosystem, for the ecosystem, with the ecosystem. Like, help me understand the government side of this.
Yeah, for sure. So the goal here is that we're building something long-term. So 20 years minimum, 30 years and onward, that exists in the long term. So our strategy is that it starts with foundations and institutions, and government can come in at the start, and it can come in along the way. So as part of and we know that Mark Carney understands this, right? Like when at West, when the lumber industry was at risk because of tariffs, the things they launched immediately were access to financing
Mm,
and loan guarantees. So we
wow.
know that loan guarantees are important for the sector, and we're here to say that the small businesses and nonprofits that are part of the social finance strategy and part of like our daily life in communities need a similar structure, and it just does not exist yet. So we're working then on building it. So as part of the pre-budget consultation, we put in a document, basically a pre-budget consultation document that asks the government for two things: to come alongside the foundations and SFIs who are building this with a first loss guarantee fund, which would be like $5 to $10 million of capital, that the interest from that just absorbs some of the top level losses, and look at participating as essentially an institution with $250 million of their balance sheet. It requires no cash transactions upfront, and is just the interest on that money that they're already investing would cover some of the losses. And I can break it down on like a $1 million. So we say we have a foundation who's putting in a $1 million pledge towards impact guarantee. They're essentially still investing those funds where their investment policy leads them, right? Equities, whatnot, etc. And it adds some impact, like social, environmental, like
Mm.
cultural impact to that money, just by the nature of being in the pool. And then when there's a call, um, it can look like a grant coming out, or a membership fee, or whatnot. So if you're putting in $1 million, we're expecting that on an annual basis. Once the pool is like fully up and running, the calls to the guarantors could be from like $17,000 a year to about $40,000 a year, which for many of those institutions looks like a small grant. So if you imagine that with like at scale where you've got like 50 to the 300 million, this can really support all of those SFIs to do what I'm going to call braver work. Our job as new forms of like community finance isn't to replicate an existing system that does not work. It's to try to get financing into the system in a way that can work by both strengthening social capital of the entrepreneurs as well as their like financial abilities to grow their organizations.
That's so cool. I love that idea. So it doesn't even necessarily like, sit on, it's not an expense for them for the whole $1 million. It
Yeah.
really is, they can invest that in their normal investment portfolio of stocks and bonds and keep earning market rates of return, hopefully with some screens involved on those,
Yeah.
but, very much earning that. And then, but at the same time, that money is almost doing double duty, that it is, earning them the market rate of return, but then it's also serving this side purpose of acting as that loan guarantee.
Yeah, it's exactly that. It's the double duty, Tim, and their money is still earning, and there is a concession, right? So the concession they take is like, and our data on the model currently is it's between like 3% and 4.5%. So it is like a concession. But if they're a foundation or entity that's already granting and already putting other money in, they can like flip it around and show it in different ways using their like GRIs or their program related investments and or other structures that they might have.
Amazing. I love that. That sounds like a very clever sort of accounting. I don't want to call it a trick, but I would call it a tactic, being able to sort of squeeze the most impact out of every dollar, of
Yeah.
those endowments. I think that this is a really, really clever way to do it. Okay. So I love this idea. I'm sold. I want to support you. I know
Nice,
there
you're
are others
in.
listening that are like, heck yeah, let's do this. How can we support Julia?
Yeah, for sure. So we have a website, impactguarantee.ca, and it's you can go there. If you're talking with your MP, if you're in a community that has an example of an organization building a land trust or using community bonds for housing or for community hubs, or you've got a micro lending outfit in your community, or a commercial lending outfit that is one of the social finance intermediaries, talk to your MPs and your MPPs about how vital that is as community infrastructure. Like we know we need these things, and help them see that, look, talking about things like loan guarantees and access to financing for the nonprofit sector is important. We know we have a budget coming out on November 4th, so we'll be eagerly and anticipating what is or is not in that. And regardless of where this budget is, we know that community work is super important, and access to capital to do things is part of how we have an actual economy. So I think that will still happen. And I think the other thing to do would be is really like seek out other ways to be investing your money, and really just think more deeply about that, which is something I'm like just I'm going to say on the starting edge of doing. My kids are now old enough where I don't need to fully worry about what is next for savings. I've been dumping all my money into RSPs and such. And one of the things we're advocating for in the sector is like more RSP eligible direct community investments. And once those types of things happen, and the sector can be head to head with the other types of investment opportunities, that will dramatically change the game.
Amazing. That's so cool. And I think, I think you and I are aligned that there just needs to be more people like us, people working in the community finance space, but also who aren't afraid to put their own money,
Yeah.
into this area. How, what do you say to anyone who's sort of like trying to get into the industry, or how can we encourage more people in the space?
Yeah, I think, well, encouraging of the more people in the space, I'm going to call it from, let's say, from the investor side, like community investors, which I think we all probably are, and could be. Look for products in your communities and look for where you can directly be making some investments, versus what I'm going to say is sometimes, and I'm guilty of this, of mindlessly just chunking things into your mutual funds, right? Like we can all go talk to our people and help ask them to like have like an ESG lens or whatnot, and begin divesting of different products. But there are things that we're still investing in that are contra to our values. And if we keep doing that, we're not going to like be able to move forward. So talk to your investment people around what they're doing, but then look at carving off a part of your investments, like the money you work really hard to earn, to put into things that matter to you. And whether that lets you do direct community investing, which then has like there's no other fees in that. Typically it's really money that goes into organizations that still earns fair rates of return. So
Yeah,
I
no
would I would
question.
look at doing that.
Awesome. I think that's a great place to start, is always, make your first impact investment, carve out part of it and then go from there. If folks are in mutual funds, get a hold of me. I can save you money in fees. Mutual funds have really high fees. So I like my
Yeah.
ETFs, but that's a conversation for another day. Julia, thank you so much for joining me. Julia
Yeah,
Grady
thanks,
is
Tim.
Executive Director of 10C Shared Space. It's been such a pleasure chatting with you today.
Awesome. Thanks so much, Tim.
If you've made it this far, you're an absolute gem. Thank you. Stay in touch by subscribing to my free newsletter. Got questions about sustainable investing? I'm here to help. Join my classroom where I have lots of resources and mini courses. I also do monthly Ask Me Anything sessions so you can get all the help that you need. Links are in the show description. Cheers.